Welcome back to the Realm of Unpopular Opinions. It is that time of year again where we do best of the year, worst of the year, absolute shittiest of the year. The last 2 years, I want to say, I've done both of the categories together, like the good, the bad, the manga usually. But this time we're going to do it separately again. And that is because I have a lot to talk about. And I just did not want for the end of the year videos to go by without any effort, because as I've just said, there is a lot to talk about in both categories. So today we are doing the worst books of the year. And I've also divided these into categories to make this easier to digest, that it's not just me hating on stuff. There's books where I see how someone could like it. There's books that I was disappointed by because I had high expectations. And then there's just, this was garbage. So let's just get into it. And I'll try, within a day or two, include best books of the year, because I don't know which usually is more fun to do. I like watching worst books of the year always a little bit more, because I feel like even then, some of the reviewers are actually very honest. So let us get into it. Our first category of the day, as you have seen from the title, is disappointments, which means these are books that I expected better from. I wanted them to be much, much better than they actually were, because disappointments can only happen if you've had expectations or standards. And the first book in this category that I will hopefully not drone on about, but we have to mention it, is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Mrlja. I'm gathering steam to talk about this. This was incredibly difficult for me to read. Granted, I did read it at the worst time of year, which was, I think, May through to July, maybe. I don't even know at what point I read this, but I do know that it was the middle of the year. So that already was setting it up for failure. But even though people told me that this was a famously boring book, I was like, I can handle boring. I can handle boring. I like Dune, which also has been lauded as a boring book, and I loved it. So let's give it a shot. It's Victorian England set in the Napoleonic era, which I had read at the beginning of the year in Naomi Novik's Temeraire series. I was ready. I liked the era, and magical learning in England. Excellent. So expectations, I was somewhat expecting to be bored, but I was also hoping that I wouldn't be, because I felt like if that was the premise, everything that people found boring about it, I wouldn't necessarily find boring. Boy, was I wrong. I hated my time reading this book. It was a chore. First of all, it did not need to be that long. There are many books where you get to the ending and you think that this is missing several hundred pages. Not the case with this. This could have easily been. Now, granted, again, I have the hardcover, so I think the paperback is over 1,000 pages. But at least several hundred pages could have easily been cut, because you lose steam by the middle, and then that last chunk just felt torturous. Now, since I had previously watched the series and liked the series because it condenses all of the boring stuff from the book, and I love the actors, so they sort of added a life to the story. That last chunk, I think I was in a reading slump because of it. I literally sat down one day, skim read until the ending, and then properly read the ending, because I was like, I need to get this book out of sight. I never want to see it again. It was just awful as far as reading experience goes. Let's move on to the actual plot. I feel like this is the book that requires an explanation the most, because it's not so simple why I hated it, because part of it is a personal preference thing. I hated the characters, hated them. Now, I dislike unlikable protagonists in general, but this was just not on any level acceptable behavior as far as I'm concerned. Jonathan Strange, I despised. Which ironically in the series, it was the other way around. I didn't like Mrlja that much, and I liked Strange. could have been just down to the actors, but despised Jonathan Strange in the book. I felt like he treated everyone in that book with absolute contempt and so cruelly. He was just a horrendous person. Mrlja, who I quite loved as a character as opposed to the series, then out of nowhere makes a remark or something where I'm like, okay, so I'm apparently not supposed to like you either. And it just ended up being a very tediously written book about people that I did not care for. I don't know how people can get invested in unlikable characters. I can't. To top it all off, and this will be the last complaint that I have because I can already tell that I've been yapping for too long about this abomination of a book, she can write interesting things. It is proven by the footnotes. I loved the footnotes. I thought I would be annoyed by them. That was the only bit of the book that I was actually mildly interested in. Anytime there was a long footnote, I rather would have read that entire thing than the chapter about the two of them in war, or rather, Strange. I loved the footnotes, which means that she can write interesting magical stories, but she refuses. So not only does she have unlikable people, they also don't do much magic. So this is no longer a fantasy. It felt borderline like a political, historical narrative at one point, and I was like, there is no magic here. There's absolutely no magic here or wonder or anything that she gives you in the footnotes. The Raven King, the fairy stuff, none of it, okay? None of it. I'm exaggerating when I say none, and I feel like I'm not really articulating my point that well, but that is because I've blocked out everything from this book because I hated it that much. I know that at one point I was like, okay, let's say that they're rivals and unlikable absolute asshole men. If they had like magical duels or contests or, tried to compete who would learn more magic or discover the ancient texts or traverse through the magical lands, that would have been mildly interesting. Mildly interesting. None of that. Absolutely none of that. Both their characters and the smidgen of magic that you got in the ending sequence. I think, if not the last chapter, then the last few, liked that bit. I would have given it 1 star if not for that last section. And I wrote that in the book itself, like on sticky notes. Like, I liked the ending. Doesn't redeem it like at all, but I liked the ending. And if their dynamic and how it was written and magic and everything was approached the way it was approached in that ending sequence throughout the entire book, I would have liked it. But since it wasn't, I hated it. I hated it, but again, it's not in the hated section because I did not want to hate this. I really didn't. Like, Victorian era magicians in England with fairy folklore, this could have been excellent, and I was prepared to be bored if the payoff was worth it. It was not. It was not. So I think to call it boring would be putting it mildly, that I absolutely despised this book. The next one that is absolutely a crime against literature and marketing that I've already spoken of, so this won't be a long segment, The Binding. I'm not mentioning any of the authors because I do not remember. This is why I put covers on the screen. The Binding. The way that this book and everyone who speaks about it lies to you is absolutely horrendous. And I think that it can find its audience if it doesn't blatantly lie to you. Okay, everyone that I've ever seen speak on this book, the premise included, this is why I borrowed it from the library, is that there's this concept about locking up people's memories into books, and then there are these book binders who do this and care for these books. That is in fact not what the book is about. That is in fact not at all what the book is about. Now, I do not consider this a spoiler because I would not have considered it a spoiler. I would have liked to have been warned what this book actually is before going into it, because my expectations were shot to hell. This is why this is a disappointment in the entire marketing strategy for this book. This is, in fact, a gay love story. It is. It just is. Whether you like that or not, that is what it is. The concept carries the book forward. gets you interested in it, and then never deals with it. Ever. There are several implications in the last chunk of the book that are never spoken of, never addressed, never even thought of as groundbreaking in terms of the concept of this book binding your memories into books. None of it. This is a gay love story. That is what it is. If that is your thing, read it, because the magical, unique aspect of it, not the point of the book. Not why you should read this. Because I read it for that reason, and it did not go well. It absolutely did not go well. And this is such a very, very strong lie, because the marketing, the appearance of the book, how everyone speaks on it, you highlight the thing that isn't the most important thing about this story. And I was angry, to say the least, when I realized how poorly this was presented on the internet in general. And I hated it. It felt like that unique story concept was just there because no one would buy the book if it was just a gay love story, which isn't true, which obviously isn't true. So if you want to see two men falling in love, go for it. But if you are at all interested in the magical aspect of this book, do not bother. Do not bother, because the author didn't either. Last disappointment, and this one was actually a disappointment, All the Wandering Light by Heather Fawcett. I read all of the Heather Fawcett books this year. I think I haven't finished one, and then there's one more middle grade, but I've read all of the Heather Fawcett books this year. This one was just, it's sort of like the last one. This is why all of these are disappointments. It felt like these books are disappointments for the authors as well, not just the readers, where it felt like they wrote it with their left toe. You know, like they were told they needed to publish it, and they wrote it with so little care that you can see that in the finished product. And that is so disappointing, because while book one of this duology wasn't the greatest thing ever, it was very typical YA, I quite enjoyed it anyway. It reminded me of when I was actually a young adult and I was reading Shadow and Bone, Red Queen, and all the other YA of the time. It reminded me of that, with all its good sides and bad sides, but it had a lot of potential because I thought that it could do the thing that it was doing very well and actually subvert what I was expecting to happen. It doesn't subvert anything. Book two is an abomination. You can so tell that she just wanted to get it over with. And I do think that that is because this was her debut series. It wasn't that popular, but it did give her a name to write other stuff. So I think she wanted to move on to other stuff, but she did still need to finish it. So she just shat this out and probably never saw anyone talking about it ever again. And there's a reason. There's a reason. The first book had vision. It had a core. It had a structure. There was a plot thread that was going on. This book is just a mess, start to finish. Character-wise, character motivation-wise, relationship-wise, stakes-wise, what's going on, how quickly it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, what the implications are. Scale, nothing about this book was right, essentially. Like, the first one was simple in the best way possible, where it was aware what it was, and that is why I enjoyed it, despite it being very, like, cliche and cringy in the YA way. It still did what it wanted to do successfully. This did nothing successfully. This did absolutely nothing successfully. I was just rolling my eyes start to finish, and at the very few things that it did right, I was still rolling my eyes because they were sort of, you know, concealed in piles of crap, and it was very difficult to dig through, and that's a shame. That's a shame, because Heather Fawcett is a good writer. Like, she is a good writer. I know this. Even Emily Wilde, that I didn't enjoy, was well written and well made for what it was. This was just so lazy, and you can tell it was lazy. Like, I feel like if I was speaking to Heather, I'd be like, you put so much care and thought into your books, even the ones that I don't personally like. But if you tell me that you put thought and care into this and didn't just write it, you know, like half of it in an afternoon with no rewrites, I wouldn't believe you. I wouldn't believe you. I just wouldn't. And it's a shame, because a lot of her books are going to be in my favorite books of the year. So disappointment, because this wasn't the first book that I read by her. It was like, I think, the fourth or fifth. So yes, disappointment is an understatement, because again, She is now one of my favorite authors of all time. So this just, her being this lazy did absolutely disappoint me. We've made it to the second category, the absolutely not for me category. Now, these are books that I personally, obviously, either disliked or hated because they are on this list, but I could in some realm see how someone might like them. I am not generally the type of person who, if I hate a book, think of how someone might like them, but I do occasionally see the point of view of someone who can like it. I just know that it's very much not for me. This is one of those rare instances. The first book is Miss Newberry's List. I said in the video where I talked about it, I do not even know which one it is. I think one of the vlogs, that I don't like romance. And I went on and on about why I don't like romance as a genre, why it does nothing for me. Which is why I don't, this is on my list, but I don't, I would never say that this is an objectively bad book, because I got it recommended from people who like romance and they liked it. So it has its audience. I just am not it. I am just not the audience for this genre in general, for this particular book in general. And I couldn't give it more than 2 stars because I got nothing from it. So this is just a very, very brief instance. And as someone who does like a good romance in another plot, like I do not want that to be the main plot with very few exceptions. I said in that video that the problem with romance for me is that if I don't personally see myself in either of the characters, then I just do not care about the resolution. That was the problem with this book. I did not care about either of these people or them getting together because neither of them were relatable to me in the slightest. So no, I did not care. And I know there are people yapping about like, but can you not see the point of view of others and, like put yourself into that situation? No, that is in fact not how reading works for me personally, because if the entire point of the book is getting invested into these 2 people coming together, I need to personally like at least one of them, and I did not. So that is that for that book. I hope you like it. If you like this type of romance, search up like what kind of romance it is, and then luck be with you. The next one that I put into this category, I could have put it into objectively bad, but I didn't. The Setting Sun by Dazai. This book, this book just made me angry with its point of view. Now, this is definitely a tired take from people who have read this book. I'm certain of it. But this author writing from the point of view of a woman felt deeply gross to me. Just her thoughts and her obsession with certain things just didn't feel right. I'm sure there are men, I can't think of them off the top of my head, who write from the point of view of a woman and do it fairly well. He is not one of them. He is not one of them. This just felt, I don't know how else to describe it, but both of his books, although the other one didn't make it into this list, feel like, you know how books or films sometimes feel like books or films, but sometimes they feel like you can see the writer? This didn't feel like a story. This just felt like me seeing the writer. I could see him sitting down at a desk and writing from a woman's point of view instead of seeing a real woman. I could see the man behind her like words and thoughts, if that makes any sense. So if you liked this book, again, that's your thing. I didn't viscerally hate it because I frankly put it out of my head, but I did hate my time reading it. I really hated the point of view, and it was just a miserable time to read this. So I didn't like anything about it. But with classics, I'm a little bit more, unless there's something I personally super hated, I'm a little bit more inclined to like give it grace and say that you should decide if this is objectively bad. So that's it for the classic. I've spoken about some of these before, but let's be very quick. 6 Deaths of the Saint. That's a mouthful. I spoke about this in my last video, if you want to go in depth about why I hated it. Very personal reason. Like, this is one of those books where I genuinely have to say this is just not for me. I am specifically not the target audience of this. So if you want to know exactly why I despised it, look at my last video. But yeah, this is for someone else to enjoy, definitely not me. This one might make someone mad, but if someone is in the mood for getting mad, that is their business. Fire and Blood. I read this because I watched the series during the summer. I still can't believe that was this year. Frankly, 2024 feels like it has been going on for like years. But yeah, I watched the series this summer, so I picked up the book. I read the book originally when it came out, like sort of, not completely, but this time I read the bits that are like before and after the series and during the series completely, so I could have some context or whatever. I just do not like this man, like at all. His writing, what he focuses on, how he writes character, I do not like anything about him or his writing, or his, rather not about him, because I do not know him as a person. I don't like anything about his worldview and what he chooses to focus on at all. So this is deeply, deeply not for me. And while I would put it into objectively bad, I've been told that I can't do that because like it's objectively decent writing. But I still think that the entire universe is bad. So make of that what you will. I think it's bad, but he's obviously one of the most popular authors of today, even though he isn't writing anything. So make of that what you will. I hate him, but no one else does. So that's why he's in this part of the video, because I am allowed to acknowledge that he is very much not for me. This entire category has been very aptly named. Coraline, I also spoke on this in the last video. Not for me, not just because of the childhood trauma. I just do not like Neil Gaiman. Nothing to do with like the new controversies, or not even controversies, like the crimes that he's allegedly committed or whatever. I don't care about that. I don't care about celebrities as people anyway, especially writers, because their work is what I am coming into contact with. So I do not care about Neil Gaiman, but I don't like him as a writer. So it's very simple, sort of like the last one. I have nothing else to say. I just do not like him as a writer. Similarly, I am trying to keep it short with all the books that I spoke at length about in the last video. The Nutcracker, I also don't like anything about this. Similar to Charles Dickens's Christmas Carol, it was just written in a voice and a focus that I do not enjoy at all. I didn't like anything about this. Perhaps if I had somehow read it as a child, but I also don't think I would have really liked it back then, because it has a very specific quality to it that I just do not vibe with, or that just doesn't resonate with me. So a lot of these books are beloved, but I severely disliked them or even hated them, which is why they're in this part of the video. I'm sorry I'm not being way more articulate about these, but I yapped about it in the last video, so I really don't want to repeat myself. The last one is a random one that I forgot to talk about last time, but it's Through the Woods, and this is a graphic novel, which I read, I want to say in October, or at least around Halloween. I'm a little bit unusual in the sense that I knew this was horror, which I don't like, but I still read it. So it's not that shocking that I didn't like it, but I read it and I didn't like it. So it's sort of in this video. I don't know why I'm justifying myself so much. It just feels a little silly to put things on the list that I read despite knowing I would hate them. But here it is. Here it is. I didn't like the art style. I don't like gore, and I've said that before about horror. I like psychological horror and like psychological thrillers and mental dread. I do not care for gore for the sake of gore. This is what this felt like. Essentially, it was just gross. You know, I was just reading the graphic novel and I was just like, okay, this isn't scary. This is literally just disgusting. And I didn't like the art style either. So go off, I guess, if you like that kind of thing. I do not, and I am sorry that I read it, because I really do need to trust myself, apparently, but it happens. It happens a few times a year that I'm a little bit too weak and I go against my own judgment and I pick up something knowing that I will hate it. So this is what this category is for. This is my favorite category because this is just books that I hated on a personal and objective level. Like, I just thought that these books were bad. Bad books, bad writing, bad characters, bad intention behind the books. The first one is Every Heart a Doorway. For context, I liked the prequel. I read the prequel first. And while it was a little bit on the nose, I'm not sure if the author is American. I think she is, because it felt on the nose with its woke, I don't like that word, but themes, like Saga the graphic novel. It was like very on the nose, not at all subtle, but I actually liked the story. I like how it was woven in. I liked the legend myth part of it. So the other stuff I didn't care that it was there and a little bit clumsily shot in. This book was the absolute opposite. It felt like the story only existed for the promotion of wokeness, which again, I don't even like that word because it feels super, super derogatory, which isn't exactly how I mean it. But you know what I mean when I say that. Like, themes just shoehorned in there for the sake of being there, not as parts of a whole, but just for the sake of being there. This is exactly what Saga felt like at very specific intervals. It felt like the characters were explaining things to you and talking down at you. This is how this felt. No story to speak of. I just felt like I was attending a lecture that I didn't even sign up for. So the prequel, excellent improvement, quite enjoyed it. But when I realized that it's going to be more like this book than the prequel, because I had the next few books and I like flipped through them and I saw which characters and focuses on and stuff, I was like, that is not happening. That is simply not happening. So I hated this, and I think it was objectively bad. There is no story to speak of. It just felt like a vessel for an attempted theme, which wasn't even that good. So read the prequel. Read the prequel and then read the rest of the series at your own risk. Let's just... This category is actually very mediocre compared to last year because I had such visceral hatred for Pillars of the Earth that it was so fun to include it. But this is just mild hatred at this point. But the next book is Good Girl's Guide to Murder. I've said this, I think, last year as well when I was reviewing The Sanatorium. I watch a lot of, especially UK, murder mystery, crime, and have done all my life. So I'm extremely familiar with the genre, and that is why I don't usually read a lot of it, because I feel like everything that has been exhausted about the topic under the sun I've already watched, so I don't feel the need to read. This book I can see being appealing to you if you do not interact with this genre, like at all or very, very little, because it was extremely predictable, extremely stretched, very not believable in certain parts. And I felt like, again, if you were very young and not interacting with this genre, this could be thrilling to you. I did not care for it in the least, but the thing that put it into this category, rather than not for me, was the unnecessary inclusion of animal death, which I'm just here to highlight that because I feel like I would not have read it if someone had highlighted that for me. Unnecessary. Like, animal death can be done well, obviously, like every theme. It was just unnecessary here. Like, I was already not having a good time with the book, and I thought it was juvenile and extremely predictable and just very, very cliche for the genre. And then I got to that part, and I was like, this was not necessary, like, at all. It just felt put in there so you would feel upset, like a weak way to get emotion out of you. And I did not care for it in the least. This is why it's in the bad category. So just as a warning, but yeah, I hated this book. I genuinely hated this book. Again, as someone who consumes a lot of this type of thing, it was not good. It was absolutely not good, well crafted, or believable. But just the addition of unnecessary animal death absolutely threw me off it. We make it to the last book, and I read this actually last week, and this is the end of December. So, Morisaki Bookshop. Not a book I wanted to hate. So it doesn't belong in like the first two categories because it didn't have expectations to be able to be disappointed. I do think it's objectively bad, so it doesn't fit into the not for me category. This felt, and someone has said this recently in a video, like a book engineered to be a hit. Now, part of this could be because of the translation. At several points, I thought the translation sounded horribly American, and the book is obviously Japanese, so I felt a bit of a disconnect from the book being Japanese. It almost read like it was happening in the US, which definitely I didn't like. So a lot of it could be down to the translation, but the story itself and like how it occurs and how the characters behave with each other was so unnatural that I thought this has to be a book problem and not just a translation problem. The first part, maybe I could give it a pass, but in the second part, I felt like everything fell apart. Genuinely, it's a short book. It's 150 pages. It cannot afford to fall apart as much as it did. I was just looking at the character dynamics, relationships, and like reactions of characters. Like from how much you've gotten to know the character, you expect them to react a certain way to certain things, and if they don't react that way, there has to be a narrative reason for it. And I felt like that kept happening constantly. At one point, I even thought to myself, if this is like what he's trying to do by making the main character react in this particular way, then that could be clever, but he's going to need to tell me that that's what he was intending, because otherwise I'm just reading into it. That's not what he was doing. That's not what he was doing. So there's no argument to be made about him intending certain things. And the part two just fell apart. Like, the puzzle was gone, didn't fit anymore. The pieces were missing. I was trying to put it together, but nothing was there. Every single character flew in and out of character in such a short span of time. Relationships were built and rebuilt within seconds. Nothing felt believable. This didn't feel like real people. I felt like they were changing their entire personalities on a whim. Things were forgiven that never should have been forgiven. Like, I'm being very vague. It's a short book, but for what it wanted to be, it was just not good. It was just not good. I don't know if that's a new take or not, because I didn't even want to read this book. My mother bought it in the bookstore and it was short, so I picked it up. But I remember finishing it, putting it down, and just being like, these people are so stupid. Like, this entire collection of people are so stupid. Genuinely. And I do not like reading unlikable or stupid people. I'm sorry. I might have standards. I might have standards for my characters, but at the very least, they have to be interesting, and these people weren't. Also, just as a fair warning, but all these books that are like bookshop, cafe, whatever, that's definitely the smallest part of the book. The smallest part of the book is everything about the bookshop and falling in love with reading. It just turns into a soap opera, and it was too short a book to degenerate as much as it actually did. So I am sad that I hated it, because it looks lovely. Like, the book itself is a lovely object. And I think if it sort of held on to what it was like in the beginning, it could have been good. But I remember there's this one specific dialogue, and I was telling that like to my parents, because I think they were watching something and I was reading it. And I just turned and said, like, that this was the most cliche conversation exchange that I've ever read. Like, it feels like it's directly out of a Hallmark film. So how much of that is down to the translation and how much of it is down to the author, I don't know. But even giving the translation some slack, the story itself just fell apart. If it was there in the begin with, and the characters weren't even real people. So the last book that I hated, that's for sure. And I hope I won't pick up anything else. I think I do have one more book I need to finish before the end of the year, but I'm not picking up any new ones. So this was the last just absolute crap book that I read this year. The last thing that I wanted to include that I didn't even like do in my plans for the video, but I just now remembered, and that is DNFs. I don't really discuss DNFs because I forget about them as soon as I finish them, but there's one notable DNF, and that is The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. Everyone in my house loves this book. Everyone on the internet loves this book. Okay. If I were putting DNFs into categories, this one would definitely be in disappointments because I had such high expectations for this book simply because I'm not seeing anyone hate it. And I'm sorry that I hated it because my entire channel is called Wheel of Tones. I love long books when they're good, mind you. This was a miserable time. This was the first book this year that actually put me into a slump. I think I hated my time with it. I think I stopped between page like 400 and 300 and 400. And I realized that just looking at it made me not want to read at all. So this was the first book before Strange and Mrlja that made me just despise the very act of reading. And why, you might ask, even though I've spoken about it before, it was mind-numbingly dull. It was mind-numbingly dull. So again, if you've heard me speak before about dull books are very subjective because I expected to find Dune boring. I didn't. I wanted to not find Strange and Mrlja boring. I did. I wanted to very desperately not find this boring because I love revenge stories, and I felt literally physically ill at the thought of having to continue reading this. Every time I picked it up, I would just sigh when I saw what the next chapter was about. I watched 2 adaptations this year, and I've read the entire plot summary. Like, I know what the story is about. I know how it ends. I know where each character goes. And it was not worth the pain of getting there. Because if at 400 pages, I look back and realize that there's maybe 2 or 3, if we're being generous, sequences that I didn't absolutely hate reading, then it is time to quit. It is time to quit. So this isn't the length of the book. I've read long books and I love long books. It is absolutely the style. Absolutely the style. Like, you can tell he was making money by writing a lot. This came out weekly. Maybe if I had read it weekly, I would not have found it this horribly boring, but I am a little sorry, again, that I hated this this much, because on paper, it sounds like a story that I would love, and I loved the adaptations. Actually, I really love the revenge aspect of the book, but I think the revenge was only getting started where I DNF'd it, and then I realized that there was, like, what, 800, 700 pages left to get to the revenge, and I just sat there and I was like, I am not doing that to myself. I am not doing that to myself, because this was genuinely a miserable, miserable time. So if by some accident someone out there also found this boring, you are not alone. You are not alone. This is a safe place. You are not alone. Because I'm never doing that to myself again. And I feel a little bit bad because I got that book. I bought this book individually 3 times in very different editions. So no one wanted to like it more than I did. But at some point, you just have to stop torturing yourself. That is it. That is it for the video. I hope you found it fun or funny in some way. But thinking back on it now, it's a little lackluster compared to last year, because last year I had such strong feelings for the books that I hated. This sounds very weird to say, but this was not a good year for bad books. I read a lot of shitty books, but I didn't hate them as much as I did the books that I read last year. Now, one disclaimer, though, this year, you may or may not know, but I read the little black classics and the little modern classics. I read, like, what, 200 of them, maybe more. I think like 200 of them, almost 200. So 200 small books. I did viscerally hate a lot of those, but I just don't include them in wrap-ups, or I don't speak about them, because I want to do one long comprehensive video reviewing the box sets and the collection of classics, like what I hated, what I loved, what I felt lukewarm about. I want to make an entire video about those, so I just don't mention them. But obviously, if you want to know my thoughts, you can check Goodreads. But I don't think I even logged those that I DNF'd, and I DNF'd quite a bit, quite a few of them, because if a book cannot grab my attention in 50 pages, it's never going to grab my attention. there are a lot of DNFs. There are a lot of books that I absolutely hated its existence and inclusion in the box set. So I feel like specifically because I read so many of them this year, I feel like I'm skipping through some of the stuff that I hated. But you're gonna have to wait for that video. That one's definitely going to be a long one because I want to do it properly with all the ratings that me and my dad did, because we're gonna like tally it and make scores and rankings and whatnot. But I am droning on and on. One of these days we're going to talk about favorite books of the year, and off the top of my head I think it's going to be not again as good as last year because I read my favorite book of all time last year, but it's going to be pretty good. This year my favorite books of the year is definitely going to be the video that I prefer to do because I feel a lot more strongly about the books on there. So what books did you hate this year? What books did you hate? Do you agree with any of my picks? Do you hate some books that you think are going to be in my favorites of the year, which is always fun to hear? But what did you hate reading this year? We need to free our inner hater in a time where hating anything is apparently seen as very stupid. So I will see you in the next video.